I was in a Sparrow's Pizzeria in August of 2001 when a terrorist walked in and blew himself up. Terrible, terrible event, killed 15 people, and I basically survived it.
Well, hello there.
Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you.
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm great. No complaints.
That's a good thing. And who do I have the pleasure of speaking to today?
So my name is Binny Freedman. I'm actually very curious how this works, that you get on a show and do a podcast and have no idea what the podcast is about.
Absolutely none. So Binny Freedman, tell me, who is Binny Freedman?
Okay. I grew up in Manhattan. I went to Israel when I was 18 after high school to do a gap year program. Fell in love with the country, decided to stay a second year. I went to I guess you'd call it a higher institute of Jewish study, and spent a couple of years there, decided to stay in Israel. Thought that if I was going to stay in Israel, I should kind of do the right thing. I think if I would have stayed in America, I would have done it there. And I joined, you actually get drafted, but that's another story. I was in the Army for a few good years, became an officer, a company commander, etc. Then after that, I decided I wasn't going back to America to study with 18-year-olds. I was already 24. So I stayed in Israel. I currently run a gap year program for 18-year-olds out of high school. It's basically a leadership development program and also a higher institute of Jewish learning at Yeshiva. I think what attracted the interest of the person who sent me an email and was interested to have me on your show was that I was in a Sparrow's Pizzeria in August of 2001 when a terrorist walked in and blew himself up. It's a terrible, terrible event, killed 15 people, and I basically survived it. And that was, she saw an email that I sent out to a couple of people. I think that's what piqued her interest, but that's the short version.
Wow.
I'm married. I have 4 kids. 2 of them are married. I have 3 grandchildren and a 4th on the way. That's the short version.
So Binny, I tell you, I am fascinated with the state of Israel. I am fascinated with the Holocaust. I am fascinated with everything that happened to enable you guys to become the country that you are today. And I know why they put us in touch. Some of the things are based on what you said. Mm-hmm. But what a David and Goliath story, right? Israel really is. I mean, I'm not so sure anymore because I think you guys have become a little bit of the Goliath, right? But certainly at the beginning, it was...
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it was David. And I mean, being in a place where a suicide bomb happens right in front of your face, I mean, I can't even comprehend that.
You know, it's interesting. There are a lot of different thoughts come to my head, but it's interesting because I was in the Army and I served in Lebanon, did my share of Intifada duty. This was a very different experience for me because when you're in the Army and you're, I don't know, in Lebanon or whatever it is, in the back of your mind, you kind of recognize that something could happen, even though you're not always thinking about it. So whatever happens, you're sort of trained for it. Your instincts kick in. Had a lot of different stories in the Army. And it's not even, in the movies, when those things happen, there's great music and they paint it as sort of heroism. In reality, it's not really heroism. They just train you so well that when it does actually happen, you're under fire, whatever, it just kicks in. By the time you realize you should have been scared, it's over. At least that was my experience. This was very different because it was so unexpected. I was in the middle of reading a book. I was in the middle of a baked ziti. It was the loudest I've been under artillery fire. This was the loudest explosion I ever heard. And it takes you a minute to realize what just happened because it's just incongruous. You're sitting in a pizzeria in the middle of Jerusalem on a beautiful summer afternoon, places full of women and children and families and, people just taking a break from the heat and having an ice cream. It's almost beyond, it remains beyond my comprehension how a human being can be educated to the point where it becomes not only okay, but almost an ideal to do something like that. I think it's something that we in the West have, and it's good that we have difficulty comprehending that. And what's really tragic about it is, these things occupy the news for, a few minutes a day. And then, it sort of fades. But some of the families that, sort of their lives completely changed. There was a woman, just to give an example, her name is Hannah Nechenberg. And she was she had I think it was a 6-year-old daughter. And she was in a coma. The daughter survived. She was in a coma, or maybe the daughter wasn't there. I don't remember. She is still lying in a facility in a vegetative state. Last I read about her husband just refused to get remarried, visits her every day or every week. And here's this girl. This was 2001. So you're talking about 22 years ago. So you got this woman who's 28 years old, and her mother is a comatose person in a hospital bed, and the rest of the world has moved on. There was a fellow named Arnie Roth. I think his wife's name is Freeman, and they had a daughter, Malky Roth. And I've read up a lot about her because what was the luck of the draw that I happened to be sitting in the back and she was in the front, and she was 15 years old, looks to be this incredible kid, and she'll be 15 forever. And she would be today, what is it? I don't know, 32, 33. She'd be married. She'd have kids. They'd be grandparents. The world kind of moves on. And you take a step back from that one event, and you look at the Middle East and you think, the world could be so different. There's no value to this, that they haven't accomplished anything. It's beyond my comprehension. What are you going to do?
I'm going to ask you a question that may be a question too far, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And of course, you get to decide whether you want to answer it.
Sure.
Can you walk me through the experience that you had that day?
Sure. It's interesting. I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'm happy to do that. I wouldn't say happy is the right word, but I don't mind. About a year after this happened, I get a call from a family, and I'm embarrassed to say I forgot the name of the family because I didn't stay in touch with them. But they had somehow gotten my name. I had basically this happened on a Thursday afternoon at 2:00 in the afternoon. Friday morning, my head was like all over the place. I was just like, it was really starting to hit me. So I decided to put my thoughts down on paper, and I wrote down this like long email, and I sent it to my dad. And as an afterthought, I sent it to a colleague who in America who had been giving me a hard time because, I don't know if you remember, but the second Intifada broke out the year before, and as a company command had a lot of different stories. And he said, like, you should share with people what you're going through, and you'd give me a hard time. So I said, what, I'll copy him. And somehow the email got out there and went viral. At the time, there was not much else going on. So this family called me up. They had a son who was, I believe, in Yeshiva University. He had just finished his first year of college and was going back, if I'm getting it right, to his sophomore year. And he happened to be sitting in the front. And like me, he walked out with nary a scratch. Only he had a very different experience than I did. It sent him into a tailspin. He couldn't sleep at night, started having nightmares, failing his courses, eventually dropped out of school, refused to get therapy, and they didn't know what to do. And so somehow they got my name and asked me would I be willing to speak to him. So at the time, we had gone for a few years to Florida for work. And I said, I'd be happy to. The next time I was up in New York, we got together. And I spent a few hours trying to get him to seek counseling, which I think eventually he did. When I got home, my wife said to me, you went through this horrendous event and you never got therapy, you never got counseling. Maybe you should go see a counselor. Like maybe you're bottling something up inside and it's going to explode one day. It's not healthy. Now, I didn't personally think I needed to do that, but I've learned over the years, if your wife makes a suggestion, it's just simpler to do it. It's just, So I went the easy way. I found somebody in our synagogue who kind of dealt with this and, asked them if I could talk with them and, do I have some form of dormant, PTSD or something. In the end, so I spent an hour with him. In the end, he felt that I didn't need counseling and therapy, but he told me two interesting things. He said, first of all, he said, healthy people deal with unhealthy situations in healthy ways. So that's why he felt that. And then he said, like because of all your army experiences, you're whatever it was at the time, 35, 40 years old, you're much more prepared for this. But the second thing he said to me, which was really fascinating, was we were planning, we had, I was flying with the whole family to Florida. I think it was Monday we were flying, or Tuesday, right after this event, a few days later. So we were in the middle of packing up. I didn't really have time to process this. And somehow people heard about this. When I landed in America, the fellow who was meeting me said, look, we got a call from CNN. They want to know if they can interview you. Now, I don't know about you. If CNN calls up and says they want to do an interview, okay, right? The next thing I know, literally for like the next 2 or 3 weeks, I was on CNN, MSNBC. It was crazy. In fact, I remember on September 6th, I got a call from Miami News 11. They had heard about the story, wanted to come up to Boca Raton and interview me. And I said, I'd be happy to interview. And they came up. And by this time I had learned, if you're getting that kind of platform, there's a lot you can do with it. And I asked this reporter, I said, I don't understand. I mean, this is like, this happened on August 9th. This was September 6th. Why is this still news? And she said to me, Americans have never met a victim of terror that can speak to them. Like you speak English, you're American, whatever. Needless to say, 5 days later on September 11th, I was quite forgotten. But I think so this guy told me, because you talked about it so much, you kind of got it out. So that's why I don't mind talking to you about it. I actually think it just became, I never go into that. I had been in that spiral exactly twice. I was in a ride. I caught a hitch from where I live into Jerusalem. I was basically going to clear up my desk because we were, flying to Florida and packing up 5 days later. And in the middle of the drive, the fellow driving the car realized, he had made a mistake and he needed to go to the other side of town. So he apologized. He wasn't going to get me to where I thought I was going. I said, okay. I got off near the central bus station. And because I was sad that I was leaving Israel and I didn't know when I'd be back. So I thought, instead of taking a bus, I'll just walk through, walk in Jerusalem, enjoy it. And round about the corner of King George, where the Sparrows is, I started getting hungry. I was halfway to where I needed to get to work. So I decided to go in for a baked ziti. And I'm standing in line. You know when you go into a restaurant while you're waiting on you kind of eye the tables and decide where you're going to sit. So I had my eye on this table. It was like near the front door. It looked to be like a breeze, whatever. And as I'm, sort of waiting in line, this woman walks in with what looks to be about a 6-year-old girl. She's sort of walks away from the counter with a couple of trays of pizza. And this girl starts screaming. I mean, throwing a temper tantrum. I later found out that the mother had wanted to sit at that table, but the girl had this fit that she wanted to sit in the back. And smart mother finally decided it was just easier so they went to the back. But in my head, I said, okay, I'm going to go sit in the back because it's like too noisy here. That 6-year-old girl absolutely saved my life. I saw what happened to that table afterwards. I ordered a baked ziti, and I'm waiting for the baked ziti. And finally, they bring me the baked ziti. I never do this. I mean, my wife jokes about it. I'm the guy who gets the steak, and I'll just eat a raw steak because I don't want to tell them to take it back. It's embarrassing. But for some reason, I touched this baked ziti. It was cold. And I said to the woman behind the counter, I said, would you terribly mind just heating it up? She says, no problem. So she starts heating up the baked ziti, and I'm waiting 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And then she says, you don't have to wait. You can, because I already had an apple pie. She said, you can go to the bin. I paid already. You can go sit in the back, and I'll have somebody bring you the baked ziti. So I did. I sat in the back. And, a few minutes later, this guy shows up with the baked ziti. And then I noticed out of the corner of my eye, he went to talk to somebody. So that big ziti absolutely saved his life. And then at about 2:00, I was in the middle of eating, and this massive explosion, just unbelievable. I don't know if you've ever been in a car accident, but if you're ever in a car accident, there's this moment, like after the impact, when everything stops, and it's like the sound gets sucked out of the air, like everything's quiet until so that's what happened. There was like a minute or two, there was like no sound. I don't know if that's because my ears were blocked by the blast or because people were in shock. It took about a minute or two, and I'm sitting there trying to figure out what just happened. That, there was pieces of the ceiling were hanging. And then, of course, you realize after a minute, okay, this must have been a terrorist bomb. And when we were in the Army, one of the things they taught us was if you're ever in a situation like that, you have to get away from the epicenter. There was a place called Marjaoun, which is in South Lebanon, which is the first place they did this. They set off a massive bomb, and then they waited about 4.5 minutes when all the security forces arrived, and they set off a second one. And they learned that you have to first get everybody out, wait a certain amount of time. So at first I told everybody, like, wherever the epicenter was in front. So I started yelling to people to calm down and let's just stay back here a little bit, make sure that it's safe. And then I realized we're in a back area. I was up a few steps. There were no windows. It was just this kind of back room, and smoke was starting to fill the room because there was a massive fire in front. So then I thought, okay, this isn't a good idea. So we started working our way through, and I was telling people they get out. As I'm walking down the steps, I mean, I'm just not going to describe the scene that meets your eyes. I mean, it was just horrendous. I mean, I read later that this was the largest amount of explosives that had been used in a terrorist incident to date. There was a girl whose body was missing. They couldn't find her for 9 hours. They finally discovered that she had been blown up into one of the chimneys. There was a pizza oven that was thrown out onto the street, these massive, heavy ovens. I was walking down the steps, and there was this woman who was lying on the ground. The explosion had literally blown off her clothes. She was in her undergarments, and she was looking at me, and it looked like she was trying to say something. So, they teach you in first aid. You kind of first establish a connect. Do you know your name? And I'm sitting there and saying, "Ech korila, what's your name?" And, I took her hand, and I'm watching this, and literally the lights went out. Like she was trying to say something, and then she just died in front of me. Her name was Lily Tomashvili. I think she was probably asking about her daughter, who was also killed. I think her daughter was also 6 or 7. It was just horrendous. I mean, body parts everywhere, blood everywhere. And there just wasn't anything you could do. As we're standing there, and I'm just looking around to see if there's someone who I can help. Security forces started to come, and they started yelling at everybody who could walk. They just wanted to get us out of there, like I said before. So, you follow what they do. So we climbed out sort of through the windows, all glass, and get outside, and somebody is walking over, and he's got a radio on. And remember the days when they had handheld radios? And I hear the news, and they're saying there was just a terrorist event, and a bomb went off, and they think there are 3 people dead. They're not sure. There were way more than 3 people dead. As it turned out, there were 15 people killed. And there was one ambulance that had arrived, and there were dozens of wounded. So I grabbed a couple of guys. We ran over to the ambulance to see if maybe we could help. And they had an extra stretcher. So we took a stretcher, because the deal is anybody you can put on a stretcher just to pull them out of there in case. So we ran back in, and we did this a few times until like more ambulances arrived. And then I realized, I was sitting with my back to the steps, but I was a little over to the left. So the blast had come up. There was this sort of back room that was 5 or 6 steps up from the main front area of the pizzeria. And so the blast, I guess, had come through. And I remember when I was sitting down, it seemed to me that there had been a table to my right opposite the steps. When we walked out, I realized it didn't seem there was a table there. So I started thinking maybe he got blown into the back, and maybe he's still there. It seemed to me there was a guy sitting there. I grabbed a couple guys, we ran in with a stretcher, and sure enough, there was a guy on his back. The table was on top of him, so he was like hidden by the table. He had literally been blown out of his legs. His two legs were lying on the ground, separate from him. So we put him on the stretcher, and we put the legs on the stretcher, and he wasn't bleeding. I think the shock, it takes, I guess, a few minutes. I'm not an expert on the topic. And I'll never forget this. We're running him out to the ambulance, or one of the ambulances, and he grabs my arm. I can literally still feel his arm on my arm. I remember his face. He was a Haredi, like an ultra-Orthodox looking fellow. And I didn't know what to say to him. Like, what do you say to him? Right? And he says to me, Maka, like, what happened? And I said to him, Yibba said that it'll be okay. What else could you say to him? And then eventually, like, there were enough personnel. You just kind of got out of the way. And I stood there watching for like, I couldn't call my wife because all the cell phone covered, the cell phones were all, everybody was calling. So the system collapsed. After about a half an hour, I realized I didn't need to be there. They didn't need me anymore. So I just continued. I went back to work. Only when I got to work, the office manager was there. And she looked at me, she goes, what happened? Like, your shirt is all stained. And I looked down and I realized there was like blood all over my shirt. I just hadn't noticed it. And I'll also never forget, I managed to call my wife. And I said to her, listen, you're going to hear about this terrorist event. She wasn't worried because I never go that way. Like, it didn't occur to her that I would be there. So I'm okay, and whatever, I'll be home in a couple hours. I still had to clean out my desk. And when I got home, there was kind of like this unspoken decision. We were going to tell the kids about this. But, my kids always, when I get home, they come. And, my kids were little. The oldest, who's now a doctor, she was, I think, 10 or 11. And they all come and I'm like hugging, you can imagine after a day like that, you really hug your kids. And my daughter looks at me like, Abba, what happened? Like, that's, there was something. I don't know. It's, I think I'll be processing that day literally until the day I die. I remember walking my daughter down at her wedding, down the aisle. And it kind of hit me in the middle of walking her down the aisle. I almost missed this. I mean, if I would have been sitting a little to the right, if I would have sat at that other table, if I would have waited for my big ziti, I wouldn't be here today. And it also makes you think how many times in your life those moments occur that you're just totally unaware of. You're stuck in traffic and you're annoyed because you're in traffic. But you don't really think about the car accident that you just missed, and so on and so forth. And I think it makes you appreciate, first of all, how many people there are who struggle with so many things, and your heart goes out to them. And what a blessing it is just to breathe, just to live life, and all the gifts we have in our life that we take for granted. That's the short version,
Well, I will say, first of all, thank you for trusting me to share something like that and feeling safe enough to share that. Because although I wasn't there, the way you just explained it, I felt like I was there.
Mm.
And I will say that I nearly started crying on multiple occasions. That is absolutely horrifying on a level beyond words. And it's one thing to hear it on the news. It's another thing to hear it from someone that experienced it.
You know, good for you. I think we've become, and I don't blame anybody. It's just the nature of our society. We've become so inured to this sort of thing. It's refreshing to meet somebody who takes that pause. You know, it's I'll tell you something interesting. Um, I know that in the world, in the media, that the people that think about Israel, there are really two very distinct groups. People like you, I don't know you, but it seems, who sort of, hats off to what we've accomplished here and the Jewish people in Israel and so on. And then, of course, there's that large group that says, like, somehow Israel is, I'm not convinced that we're Goliath, but we could debate that topic. But I think people sometimes forget no one appreciates peace like someone who's seen war. I mean, that's with all the differences that we have, and certainly in Israel. I mean, if you know anything about Israeli politics, extreme left, extreme right, what we all do share in common. We may have different perspectives as to how to get there or what it means. The entire population of Israel just desperately wants peace. It doesn't matter whether you're a commander in the army, a policeman, a teacher, or you're a worker for Seeds for Peace, creating dialogue between Jews and Arabs. There's such a genuine yearning for peace. Shimon Peres, who was the president of Israel, and I can't say that I agreed with a lot of his politics, although I did respect him a lot as president. I didn't think he was a great prime minister, but I did respect. His dream was a beautiful dream, whether you agree with how he went about it. And it breaks your heart how over the last 80 years, Abba Eban who was once the ambassador to the UN and later, I think, the foreign minister, again, I don't mean this to sound ethnocentric. This is just his take as an Israeli. He talked about the fact that the Arabs have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. The history of the state of Israel is just one long series of missed opportunities. And it's just heartbreaking. If it could have been so different, it could have been paradise. It and still could be. It's a shame. But I'll tell you something else, which is interesting to think about, because eventually you get to the question of, well, so what's the problem? What do we do? And, if you ask people what's the biggest problem in the world today, I don't know, people will talk about hunger, people will talk about poverty. If you ask a Jew, again, I'm looking at it through a Jewish lens, they'll talk about assimilation or anti-Semitism. Those are all symptoms. They're not the real problem. They're symptoms of the problem. The real problem is education. If you educate your kids to hate, you're never going to have peace. And until we succeed in changing the way education is pursued in the Middle East, we're just never going to get there. It's one of the most refreshing realities that's sort of rising in the last couple of years are the Abraham Accords. And I have some friends. I haven't yet gone, although I hope to. But I have friends who visited, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. Who would have imagined that you'd walk into a supermarket in the UAE, and they'd be selling Israeli products? And one of the interesting things is that there's a genuine education there towards dialogue and peace. It's very different from what we experience locally. I remember, I'll give you a great example of this. I remember when, not the current king of Jordan, Abdullah, but King Hussein, who was his father. And you could agree or disagree with his politics. He was really caught between a rock and a hard place. But there was a terrible, terrible story in a place called Nahran, which is along the Jordan Valley. It was this little peace island. It was sort of over the Jordan River, and therefore technically it was going to be Jordan. But because there were Israelis that had been farming there, they agreed that they would lease it for 25 years and give them a chance. So they called this the Island of Peace. And, they would take Israeli school trips there because you got to be in Jordan, but sort of see Jordanian soldiers, Israeli soldiers. Anyway, one day there was a school trip there, and a Jordanian soldier, a fanatic, was up in a guard tower, and he just indiscriminately opened fire. And he killed 9 schoolgirls, 15-year-old schoolgirls. Terrible, terrible story. There's a very stirring memorial there. And I remember it was not long after the peace agreement with Jordan was signed, maybe a year later, if I'm not mistaken. King Hussein flew to Israel in helicopter. He actually piloted it himself and personally visited each of the 9 families to express his condolences. And you can agree with his politics, disagree with his politics. I remember thinking, that's what peace looks like. Like, that's how it should be. And I remember he won over almost the entire population of Israel in one afternoon. Now, I'm not saying Jordan has done such a great job of educating their population since. That's a whole other discussion. But that, to me, is the biggest issue. As long as you're educating people to hate, you're never going to solve this problem. We're always going to be on the defense.
And I would say, taking what you say one step further, that the best form of education is to reintroduce people to their humanity. Because if you reintroduce someone to their humanity, they can't do these types of horrific acts. Because when you are connected to your humanity, you cannot act in an inhumane way. But when you are not connected to your humanity, you can do anything.
How do you define being connected to your humanity?
That's a great question. I would say, for myself, I am connected to spirit. When I'm connected to my humanity, I'm connected to compassion. I am connected to empathy. I am connected to goodness. I'm connected to community. I am connected beyond the mind. I am connected beyond all the conditioning that today's society puts onto us. And I'm connected to love, really. Now, am I always connected to love? No. Am I always connected to my humanity? No. But when I'm not connected to my humanity is when I do the things I'm not proud of, right? When I am connected, and by humanity, I mean, because of course one could argue that there's bad sides of humanity and good sides of humanity, right? I would say what I'm talking about when I say humanity is the good sides of humanity, love, and all the things I talked about.
I'll tell you 2 things. First of all, and it's a longer discussion, but I think that one of the healthy, habits that a person should develop that very much affects this is, before you disagree with someone, you have to be able to respect their opinion, right? You can disagree with them, but you first have to respect them. Once you respect the person's opinion, then you can disagree with them, right? In fact, in Jewish tradition, one of the ways to understand this, there's a righteous person. What's the definition of a righteous person? So one of the commentaries says a righteous person is a person who can see the righteousness in another person's perspective. If somebody has a different, I'll give you an example. You have a whole population. Every year on the anniversary of the Declaration of the State of Israel, we have 2 days here in Israel. We have Memorial Day and then immediately Independence Day. It's very different from America or from overseas, right? In America, I don't know England as well, but in America, Memorial Day, which is the end of May, it was kind of this day where, the old fuddy-duddies with their medals would go to, you'd see it on the news at night, putting some carnations somewhere. The rest of us, it was like a weekend off from school, picnics, barbecues, whatever. Not so in Israel. In Israel, I don't know if you've ever been here on Memorial Day, the entire country packs into the military cemeteries. The entire country takes a pause. I don't know anybody in Israel who doesn't know someone who fell. I lost some really good friends in Israel's wars. And, I spend Memorial Day, at the military cemetery and visiting families of guys, I was close with who fell. And the reason that they do that on the eve of Independence Day, on Independence Day, I mean, we go nuts. That's a huge celebration, parties, bands all night, getting together with friends, barbecues out in nature. Before you celebrate, you got to appreciate how many gave up how much so that you can celebrate. Now, therefore, Independence Day in Israel is considered like, that's like the most amazing celebration. But there's a whole population in Israel, Arabs, whoever they are, not all Arabs, but who actually view that day as a catastrophe. Right? They call it the Nakba, the great catastrophe. Now, you can debate who's to blame for that catastrophe that they underwent. You could even debate the nature of the catastrophe, but you can't debate that there is a population that suffered because of that day, right? I don't ever think it was our fault, but I respect that. You can only disagree with that perspective after you respect where they're coming from. Like, you have to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes, right? That's the first issue. The second issue is this idea that comes to us from the Bible. It's really interesting that Judaism, the Jewish Bible does not start with Judaism, right? Abraham comes along much later. He's the first Jew according to our tradition. It starts with the creation of the world and the creation of Adam and Eve. Whether you take that literally or allegorically, he wasn't Jewish. And there's this idea that we all come from the same person. And the Bible makes the point of saying that every human being is created in the image of God, whatever that means. You have to be able to see every human being as having an inherent spark of goodness. Sometimes it gets covered up by a lot of muck. I have no issue with Adolf Eichmann having been hung. But you first got to recognize, you got to see that there's a spark of humanity in that person. Then you can disagree with it. And I wonder what educational process would have to happen to sort of undo some of this hatred and violence that we've been seeing in the world for hundreds of years. And unfortunately, I remember when I was studying, world history years ago, the idea of the Enlightenment, which was supposed to be the enlightenment of man. Like, the First World War was going to be a war to end all wars. I mean, what a joke that was. The 20th century, when we were finally enlightened, I mean, there were more people murdered in the name of various different ideas in the 20th century than in entire world history up until that point. So it goes back to our original point. I think it's really about education.
And you say something very interesting. You say about that the most important thing is ultimately to spark that piece of humanity in people. And once you spark that piece of humanity in people, things will change. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that the way that I sparked my humanity was by facing my pain. The way that I sparked my humanity was by traveling the world, was by going into nature, was by doing things that opened me up to be able to have that connection with the divine, with spirit, with my humanity. Yeah. So maybe the answer to your question of how do you ultimately educate people to get to the place where their humanity is sparked is to take them out of their everyday lives and reconnect them to that spark of humanity inside them. And sometimes it is pain that gets them to go there. Because if we spend our time just watching the news, if we spend our time just watching Facebook, just watching Twitter, just watching Instagram, just chasing the god of money, then we are getting further and further away from that spark of humanity inside. Like you and I, we don't know each other. We've been speaking for 40 minutes, right? But something happened. Something happened in that moment, in that 40 minutes, where my humanity was sparked, your humanity was sparked, and I now feel like I know you, right? I don't know where you are. Are you in Israel?
I am in Israel. I'm actually in the old city of Jerusalem.
Okay. So you're in the old city of Jerusalem. I'm in Los Angeles. But if you and I met in a coffee shop tomorrow, it would be like we had known each other for decades, because of that one moment where our humanity touched, right? And it started based on you sharing a story with me that was profoundly moving and horrific at the same time. Yeah. So something opened up inside me as something opened up inside you. Yeah. The question is, how does one get people to have that opening? And one of the ways to do it is to stop being conditioned and to stop allowing society to determine how you think. Because so many of us do that and we're not even aware that we're doing it.
Right.
So maybe there should be schools where the aim of the school is simply to inspire people to have that moment of awakening. Because once you have that moment of awakening, everything changes. Doesn't mean you're going to be a perfect human being and you're never going to be mean and you're always going to be throwing roses at people. No, but it means that you've had that moment and there's no going back from that moment.
Look, what's scary, we see this here in Israel, and it's harder for me to judge in America, but at least from the media, it seems we've stopped talking to each other. The lines have never been so drastic. You're either with me or against me. I mean, it's remarkable to see. I mean, people won't talk to other people about who they vote for. And, the world has become so black and white. It seems to me, I read this book by a fellow named James Clear called Atomic Habits. Magnificent book. Basically, how to develop healthy habits, how to break old habits. And one of the points he makes there is sometimes we have a good idea. We want to get into a better habit, but we do too much too fast. We undermine our own goal. You decide you want to get back into shape, and you decide you're going to go running. And so you decide, okay, that's it. I'm done. I'm going to lose weight. So the next morning you wake up and you go for like a 90-minute run, and you come back and you can't move, but it's like awesome. You do this for 3 days, but what you're doing in your brain is you're creating this reality that it's so hard to do this that eventually you're just going to say, I can't do it anymore. Or today I'm tired or whatever. He says, try the opposite. He says, first develop the habit of getting up and putting on your sneakers. He says, don't do anything. Don't go for a run. Just get in the habit of putting on your sneakers. Once you've got that down a couple of weeks later, then go out and take a walk around the block. Now that you can stick with. Now, if you go out and you put your sneakers on and you walk around the block, eventually you're going to say, I'll go for a run or a bike ride or whatever your exercise is. It's the same thing. We want to create these huge projects that are so much work. We torpedo them. Sometimes I think you have to find the equivalent of putting on your sneakers. I think the equivalent in this topic is just finding someone different from yourself and talking to him. Just talk to your neighbor. Someone who supported Trump should find someone who supported Obama, and they just get together for coffee and agree to disagree. I'll give you an example. Do you know the biblical story of Joseph and his brothers?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a line in there in the verse, and it says that his brothers hated him; they couldn't talk to him, right? And eventually, Joseph is looking for his brothers. They went out to shepherd. For whatever the reason, Jacob sends Joseph to inquire after their well-being. It seems to me Yaakov understood something's going. He wanted to get them to spend time together, talk together. And it says they see him from, the verse literally says they see him from a distance and they conspire to kill him. So one of the commentaries, the Ramban, says it's only when you see a person from a distance that you can really hate him. If you get close and personal, it's harder to hate a person. Do you know what I mean? Like I once spoke, I think it was at Concordia University, and they asked me to speak about Israel, and I wasn't going to go, but there were some Jewish students there, and they felt so, embattled, like they were really going through a tough time. I said, you know what? Fine. So I went to speak, not really about politics, but somebody put in the advertisement, Binny Freedman's coming. He's going to speak about, faith and doubt or whatever, based on his army experiences. He was a company commander in the army. And by the time I got there, there were like 30 people, and they were demonstrating outside because I was like this IDF officer. And they threw these bags with red liquid, which was supposed to be blood, whatever it is. And I was going to go over and talk to them. And somebody said, no, you can't do that. It'll get violent, whatever. And I remember thinking, like, if you can't talk to them, you can't, like, they just viewed me as this figure. They didn't know me. And I didn't blame them. They were being educated to hate. So it's easier to hate someone from a distance. And it goes both ways. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't exceptions to this rule. I don't think, you get together with Adolf Hitler and say, let's schmooze. Like, sometimes a person can step over the pale. And, I happen to personally feel that Yasser Arafat was a terrorist. And I think one of the mistakes we made is, he should have been put on trial. If they could find him innocent, fine. But if he was found guilty, he should have gone to jail. We eventually compromised with certain things that I don't think we should compromise with. But there are lots of people who have very different opinions from me that I'd be happy to sit and talk with. Do you know what I mean? I think that's, and maybe it's harder to do when someone is so far from you. Find the people who are somewhat distant from you. In fact, I actually think that you can probably accomplish more on a podcast like this than a school can, because you allow people to see a perspective that's different from theirs and humanize someone who has a different perspective. And that's an awesome thing to do.
And I will tell you that I always tell people, based on my travels, they always ask me, what was the greatest lesson you learned? I don't know what you know about me, but I've done a lot of traveling. I've done a lot of traveling.
I looked you up before and I saw this, the Kindness Diaries.
Yes.
Which I'm going to watch because it looks fascinating to me. So I gather you've been around. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of lessons I learned. And the story I'm going to tell you now is one that I learned on the Kindness Diaries. They always say to me, what was the greatest lesson you learned? And I tell them, the greatest lesson I learned on all my journeys is that we're all the same. At base, at the core of our humanity. Right. We just want to be seen. We just want to be heard. And we just want to be loved. Yes, of course, there are unique differences here and there. I get it. But at base, and I tell the story of the time that I was in the slums of India. I stayed there for a couple of nights. And I woke up in the morning and I saw this. I don't know if you've been to the slums of India, but there's a tremendous amount of poverty there. Tremendous poverty. And it's easy to judge. But there's also so much love. So I woke up in the morning and I saw this lady kiss her two kids goodbye for school. And in that moment, I realized that her love for her kids is exactly the same as your love for your kids. We are the same, right? Sure. And it's why it drives me nuts when I see the news, when I see people dividing, irrespective of left or right. And it drives me nuts because all you have to do is go out into the world and meet the world, and you will see a totally different world. Look, does that mean that bad things don't happen? Of course not. Bad things happen. I get it. But more often than not, good things happen too. Right. And also another thing that is interesting, you had mentioned that if you're far apart from someone, it's easy to hate. I always tell people there is always a way to connect with someone. Again, there's a line that some people cross. You mentioned Adolf Hitler. I get it. But generally, there is always a way to connect with someone. Let's say you're a right-wing guy and someone else is a left-wing guy and you hate each other. Well, you could ask the right-wing guy, do you have a son? And the right-wing guy could, let's say yes. You could ask the left-wing guy, do you have a son? And the left-wing guy could, let's assume in this situation, say yes. You could say to the right-wing guy, do you love your son? And the guy would hopefully say yes. The left-wing guy, do you love your son? Yes. Then you have something in common. You both love your sons. Let's start from there.
It's interesting. There's a lot that, before the Sabbath on Friday night, to welcome it in, we say these in the traditional liturgy, there's this sort of series of psalms that we say. And one of them, and it speaks of like a time when there'll be peace. And one of the lines there is that the islands will rejoice. Yismechu iyim. It's a strange line. What does that mean, the islands will rejoice? And I noticed that, and I looked, I couldn't find a good commentary on it. And I never got it until the Second Intifada. And, this was after the Oslo Accords. This was after there was a Palestinian Authority. And without getting into all the details, in the first Intifada, the terrorists had like burning tires and Molotov cocktails. Second Intifada, they had automatic weapons. It was a lot scarier. And they figured out that, terrorists, that the smart thing to do was to shoot up the roads. So all of a sudden you're a civilian, you're a woman driving home and, they just open fire on you. And so people stopped traveling. I remember when we got to Florida, one night we found a babysitter and my wife and I went out to a movie. And we realized it had been ages since we went to a movie because, we lived in an area where if you got on the road at night, you were taking a risk. And we just felt we weren't so much scared as just a sense of responsibility. I know people who wouldn't, like the parents wouldn't travel in the same car, just like some people don't fly together. And I realized that's what terror wants. Terror wants to separate us. They don't want us to talk to each other. There was a youth philharmonic from the Gaza Strip before sort of, the borders got more defined. And they were on a program of sort of, one of these funds that creates dialogue. And they came to play in a mall in Tel Aviv. And some of the higher ups in Hamas found out about it and threatened the person who was running the Philharmonic, whatever. And that was the end of the program. And there was an article, I read about it, and some of the kids who spoke anonymously and they shouldn't show their pictures, were how much they enjoyed it and how interesting it was to meet Israeli, this kind of thing. And I remember thinking that's what they want, because if we talk to each other, we'll discover that a lot of this hate is nonsense. So there is that group that wants to separate you. And so the best way to fight terror is to talk to each other. 100%. That's not all, but it's a big piece of it,
Yes, and it goes back to the point of when you talk to each other, you connect with each other's humanity. And, that's simplistic. I've fortunately never been in a situation where I've been under attack. I don't live in a country that has suicide bombers blowing people up. It's somewhat easy for me to espouse this, right? I'll just talk to each other. Or I'll just, connect with each other's humanity. But sometimes the rage and the fear and the anger just gets too much and you can't. I mean, I get that. This isn't, I always tell people, I give a lot of speeches and I always tell people, look, this isn't, and the speech is about kindness, but this isn't a Pollyannish speech. I'm not sitting here telling you that all you have to do is be kind and open up your heart and everything's going to work itself out. That doesn't necessarily work that way, but it's a step in the right direction whilst also protecting yourself. Yeah. You can't be like this and open up fully because there are people out there that will eat you alive. I get that. But you protect yourself and you go out into the world and try to the best of your ability to inspire humanity to reconnect to itself, right?
Yeah. I was recently talking with somebody who actually from LA, who's now here in Israel. He came and I asked him what he's like. He must be at least 60, maybe 65. I said, what made you decide to move to Israel? He told me that he had a really frightening experience. In the middle of COVID, there was a riot along the area of Pico Boulevard. They were drawing swastikas. Maybe you heard about this. And he just didn't imagine that could ever happen in LA. And it freaked him out. And so we got into this discussion. I said, there was a story in Germany. There was a fellow, like a religious Jew who looked very Jewish, and he was beaten up, really badly beaten up for wearing a skull cap, a kippah. And a few days later, they organized a rally, and tens of thousands of Germans came from all over Germany, and they all wore kippot. Non-Jews, Arabs, they all got together and said, we're you know what I mean? There's always a way to overcome hatred. 100%. It's just it's a decision, and it goes back to education. Yeah. Anyway.
We could sit here and talk for hours. And like I said, I've known you for 55 minutes. And yet I feel like I've known you for 55 years, and that's the truth. And that's only
Jerusalem.
Say it again.
You have to come visit Jerusalem.
Do you know, I've been to Jerusalem once, but next time I come to Jerusalem, I will definitely reconnect with you. And if you come to LA, please let me know, because what a beautiful thing. This is why I do this podcast and this way, because it's just two human beings finding a way in a short period of time to connect on a level that maybe would take years if they weren't put into like a box.
Right.
Right. And thank you for agreeing to do it. Because, you know, who knows? You don't know me. I mean, that could be a nut job.
Okay. It was really a pleasure. Really.
Yes, indeed.
I don't know you, and I was curious how this worked, that it caught my, the idea that someone gets on a podcast has no idea who he's talking to. I just was so curious to see how that works. So I said to Stacy, who was the one who sent me this email, which, by the way, thank you to her. I said, okay, I got to try this. This is interesting. If you can, she said, we can do this whenever you want, so I said, okay, I don't mind. Late at night, I'm done with work. But, all right, well, it was a pleasure. Pleasure meeting you. I wish you tremendous success. Keep spreading good things. And I will start following you. Very interesting.
Thank you so much. And I hope people really are inspired by your words because they were beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Be well.
Hello everyone, it's Leon here, aka the Kindness Guy. If you like my videos, which I hope you do, don't forget to press the subscribe button and also to ring the little bell so that the notifications notify you that I have a new video out in the world.